100 lashes. That's what it takes to break a woman's spirit, or so they thought. In the dusty town of Cedar Falls, 1887, Dorothy Hale stands bound to the whipping post. Her crime not theft or murder, but the unforgivable sin of being barren. Her husband's public humiliation has turned into a death sentence, each crack of the whip echoing through the silent crowd. But sometimes the broken become the strongest. Sometimes a woman's darkest hour becomes her rebirth. Welcome to a story of redemption, family, and the unbreakable spirit of a woman who refused to stay down. Stay with us until the end of this incredible journey and let us know in the comments what city you're watching from. We love seeing how far our stories travel. The leather whip sang through the morning air with a sound that would haunt Cedar Falls for years to come, a sharp crack that silenced even the crows perched on the courthouse eaves. Dorothy Hale's scream died in her throat as the 15th lash tore across her already bloodied back. Her white cotton dress now a canvas of crimson streaks that dripped steadily onto the dusty ground below. 16! Mayor Reed's voice boomed across the town square, his weathered face set in grim satisfaction. The man wielding the whip, a hired hand from the neighboring county who'd been promised $5 for this particular brand of justice, paused to wipe sweat from his brow. The September sun beat down mercilessly, and the crowd that had gathered to witness this spectacle shifted uncomfortably in the heat. Dorothy's husband, Joseph Reed, stood at his father's right hand, his arms crossed over his barrel chest. At 35, Joseph had inherited his father's cruel streak and his mother's sharp tongue, though he'd long since lost any trace of the charm that had once convinced Dorothy to marry him. His dark eyes held no sympathy as he watched his wife of 3 years endure her punishment. "She brought this on herself," he muttered to his father, loud enough for the nearest onlookers to hear. "A wife who can't give her husband children ain't a wife at all. She's a burden, a curse on the family name." Mayor Reed nodded approvingly. At 62, Harrison Reed had built Cedar Falls from nothing more than a trading post and a dream. He owned the general store, the grain mill, and half the farmland for 20 miles in any direction. What Harrison Reed said in Cedar Falls became law, and what he believed became gospel. Today, he believed his daughter-in-law deserved every stripe she received. 17. The whip fell again, and this time Dorothy's knees buckled. The rough wooden post scraped against her cheek as she fought to stay upright, her wrists burning where the ropes cut into her skin. Through the haze of pain she could hear the whispered conversations of the townspeople. "Shameful business, this," murmured Mrs. Martha Crawley, the preacher's wife, though her eyes never left the spectacle before her. "Though I suppose the Lord works in mysterious ways." "Mysterious nothing," snorted Tom Bailey, the blacksmith. "Woman's been married 3 years without so much as a miscarriage to show for it. That ain't mysterious, that's cursed." Dr. Samuel Morgan, one of the few educated men in Cedar Falls, shifted uncomfortably beside his wife. "This is barbaric," he whispered. "Medieval. We're supposed to be civilized people." His wife Catherine gripped his arm tightly. "Hush, Samuel. You know better than to speak against the Reeds. They own this town and everyone in it." The doctor fell silent, but his jaw remained clenched as the 18th lash fell, then the 19th. Each crack of the whip seemed to echo off the false-fronted buildings that lined Main Street, bouncing between the saloon and the church, the bank and the barber shop, as if the town itself was keeping count. Dorothy's mind began to drift as the pain became everything and nothing all at once. She remembered her wedding day, how Joseph had seemed so different then. He'd been patient during their courtship, gentle even. He'd spoken of children they would have, of the legacy they would build together. For the first year of their marriage, he'd been understanding when her monthly courses continued to come. By the second year, his patience had worn thin. By the third, it had transformed into something ugly and dangerous. 25. The crowd had grown larger now, drawn by the spectacle like moths to a flame. Children pressed their faces against storefront windows while their mothers alternately shielded their eyes and craned their necks for a better view. The men stood with their arms folded, their faces masks of righteous judgment, while the women whispered behind their hands and fans. The whipmaster paused again this time to examine his instrument. The leather was beginning to fray from the force of the blows, thin strips peeling away like skin. He looked to Mayor Reed for guidance. "Continue," the mayor commanded. 100 lashes as decreed by the town council. Let no one say the Reeds don't honor their word. Dorothy tried to focus on anything beyond the fire that consumed her back. She thought of her mother dead these past 10 years and wondered what she would say about this moment. Margaret Hale had been a strong woman, a widow who'd raised Dorothy alone after her father died in a mining accident. She'd taught her daughter to read and write, to stand tall and speak her mind, to never let anyone make her feel small. A woman's worth isn't measured by the children she bears, her mother had often said. It's measured by the strength of her character and the kindness of her heart. But kindness seemed in short supply in Cedar Falls, and character meant nothing when measured against the expectations of men like the Reeds. 38. The number rang out like a death knell. Dorothy's vision blurred, black spots dancing at the edges of her sight. She tasted copper in her mouth and realized she'd bitten her tongue to keep from screaming. The white-hot pain across her back had evolved into something else now, a deep, throbbing agony that seemed to penetrate her very bones. Joseph stepped forward close enough that she could smell the whiskey on his breath. It wasn't even noon, but that had never stopped him before. "You hear that, Eleanor?" he hissed, using her given name like a curse. 38 more reasons why you're worthless. 38 more reminders of what you've cost me. Dorothy, she'd started calling herself Dorothy years ago, tired of Joseph's sneering pronunciation of Eleanor, raised her head with tremendous effort. Her green eyes, usually bright with intelligence and warmth, now burned with something entirely different. "I haven't cost you anything," she whispered, each word a monumental effort. "I've given you everything." Joseph's face darkened. "Everything you've given me, nothing. 3 years, Eleanor, 3 years of marriage, and my seed finds no purchase in your barren womb. The whole territory's laughing at me. They think I'm half a man married to a woman who can't do the one thing the Lord put her on this earth to do." Maybe. Dorothy's voice grew stronger, fueled by a rage that burned hotter than the pain in her back. "Maybe the problem isn't with me." The crowd gasped. Even the whipmaster paused, his arm raised for the 39th blow. Joseph's face went white, then red, then purple with fury. "How dare you?" he snarled, raising his hand as if to strike her. Mayor Reed caught his son's wrist. "Save your anger, boy. The whip will do our talking today." He nodded to the whipmaster. "Continue." The 39th lash fell with renewed vigor, and Dorothy's defiant words dissolved into a scream that seemed to come from the very depths of her soul. But even as her body betrayed her, her spirit remained unbroken. She would not beg. She would not plead for mercy from these men. She would endure. 50. The halfway mark. Dorothy's dress hung in tatters now, the fabric so soaked with blood that it clung to her skin like a second layer of flesh. The wooden post was slick with her blood, and the rope that bound her wrists was stained crimson. Dr. Morgan couldn't stand it anymore. He pushed through the crowd, his medical bag clutched in his white-knuckled fist. "This has gone far enough," he declared, his voice carrying across the square. "This woman needs medical attention. You're going to kill her." Mayor Reed turned his cold blue eyes on the doctor. "That's the point, Dr. Morgan. A barren wife is no wife at all. She's a drain on resources, a living reminder of failure. Better she die here in public as a warning to other women who might think to disappoint their husbands." "This is murder," Dr. Morgan said quietly. "Plain and simple. and I won't stand by and watch it happen. You'll stand by and watch whatever I tell you to watch." Mayor Reed replied, his voice like winter wind. "Unless you'd prefer to join her at the post. I'm sure there are plenty of doctors in the territory who'd be happy to take over your practice." Dr. Morgan looked around the crowd, searching for support, for any sign that someone else would stand with him against this atrocity. But he found only averted eyes and uncomfortable shuffling. Fear ruled Cedar Falls, and Harrison Reed was its master. With a heavy heart, Dr. Morgan stepped back into the crowd, though his hands never stopped trembling. 62. The whipmaster was tiring now, his strokes less precise, more brutal. Sometimes the leather caught flesh, sometimes it merely grazed skin, but each blow added to the map of agony that Dorothy's back had become. Through her pain-induced haze, Dorothy began to hear something else, a voice that cut through the crowd's murmurs and the whipmaster's counting. It was deep and steady, filled with quiet authority. "This is wrong." The voice belonged to a man Dorothy had seen around town, but never spoken to. Liam Thornwood, if she remembered correctly. He owned a ranch about 5 miles outside of Cedar Falls, and she'd heard he was a widower with children. He was tall and lean, with graying brown hair and kind eyes that seemed out of place in this scene of calculated cruelty. "I beg your pardon." Mayor Reed's voice dripped with dangerous calm. Liam stepped forward, his boots clicking against the wooden planks of the sidewalk. "I said this is wrong. What this woman may or may not have done doesn't warrant this kind of punishment. You're torturing her." "Mr. Thornwood," Mayor Reed said, his smile cold as a snake's, "I'm surprised to see you in town today. Don't you have cattle to tend?" "I came for supplies," Liam replied steadily. "I didn't come to watch a public execution disguised as justice." Joseph finally found his voice. "My wife's failures are none of your concern, Thornwood. Mind your own business. When I see a woman being beaten to death in the town square, it becomes my business," Liam shot back. "It becomes every decent person's business." The word decent hung in the air like a challenge. Mayor Reed's eyes narrowed to slits. "Are you suggesting, Mr. Thornwood, that I am not decent?" Liam's gaze never wavered. "I'm suggesting that decent men don't beat women to death for circumstances beyond their control." 75. The whipmaster's shout interrupted the tense standoff. Dorothy's head lolled forward, her consciousness flickering like a candle in the wind. Blood pooled at her feet, mixing with the dust, to create a grim mud that seemed to summarize everything wrong with this moment. Liam took another step forward. "Let me take her. She needs medical attention." "After the 100 lashes," Mayor Reed said firmly. "Not before. The law is the law, Mr. Thornwood, even if you don't approve of it." "Whose law?" Liam demanded. "Show me where it's written that a man can beat his wife to death because she can't bear children. Show me that law in any civilized place." "This is Cedar Falls," Mayor Reed replied, "and in Cedar Falls I am the law." The crowd watched this exchange with rapt attention, sensing that something momentous was happening. For the first time in years, someone was challenging Harrison Reed's authority. It was thrilling and terrifying in equal measure. 88. Dorothy's body convulsed with each blow, now her nervous system overwhelmed by pain and blood loss. Her breathing had become shallow and irregular, and Dr. Morgan noticed her lips were turning blue. "She's going into shock," he called out, unable to remain silent despite the earlier threat. "If you don't stop now, she'll die." 12 more, Mayor Reed said implacably. "The law demands satisfaction." Liam had heard enough. With a fluid motion, he pulled a Colt .45 from the holster at his hip and pointed it directly at Mayor Reed's chest. "The only thing that's going to be satisfied today is my sense of justice," he said quietly. "Cut her down, now." The crowd erupted in gasps and shouts. Several men reached for their own weapons, but Liam's gun was already drawn and steady. Joseph started to move, but his father held up a restraining hand. "You're making a mistake, Thornwood," Mayor Reed said, though for the first time that day, uncertainty flickered in his eyes. "A very big mistake." Maybe, Liam replied, but I'd rather make a mistake trying to save a life than stand by and watch murder happen in broad daylight. 91. The whipmaster, oblivious to the drama unfolding behind him, continued his grim work. Dorothy barely responded to the blow, her body hanging limp against the post. "Stop," Liam commanded, swinging his gun toward the whipmaster. "Drop the whip and step away." The hired hand looked nervously between Liam's gun and Mayor Reed's furious face. After a moment's hesitation, he let the whip fall to the ground. "Cut her down," Liam ordered. Dr. Morgan didn't wait for permission. He rushed forward with his medical bag, pulling a knife from his pocket to slice through the ropes that bound Dorothy's wrists. She collapsed immediately, her unconscious form crumpling to the blood-soaked ground. "She's alive," Dr. Morgan announced after checking her pulse. "But barely. She needs immediate attention." Liam kept his gun trained on the crowd as he backed toward the fallen woman. "Dr. Morgan, can you help me get her to your office?" "My office is no place for her," Dr. Morgan said quietly, his eyes darting toward Mayor Reed. "Not after this." Understanding passed between the two men. Dorothy would find no sanctuary in town, not after what had just happened. Mayor Reed would never allow it. "My ranch, then," Liam said. "Can you help me get her there?" Dr. Morgan nodded grimly. "I'll do what I can." As they carefully lifted Dorothy's limp form, Mayor Reed's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "This isn't over, Thornwood. You've interfered with lawful punishment. You've drawn a weapon on a town official. There will be consequences." Liam paused in loading Dorothy into Dr. Morgan's wagon, his gun still in his hand. "Maybe there will be Reed, but at least I'll be able to sleep at night." The crowd parted as the wagon began to move, Dr. Morgan driving, while Liam rode alongside, his gun still drawn. They could feel the weight of 100 stairs on their backs as they made their way down Main Street, past the saloon and the church, past the bank and the general store, past all the silent witnesses who had watched a woman nearly die and done nothing to stop it. As they reached the edge of town, Dr. Morgan glanced back at the square where Mayor Reed still stood, his face a mask of cold fury. Joseph was beside him, and both men watched the wagon with eyes that promised retribution. "You know they'll come after you," Dr. Morgan said quietly. Liam nodded, his jaw set with determination. "Let them come. A man has to stand for something, or he's not much of a man at all." In the back of the wagon, Dorothy drifted in and out of consciousness, her body broken, but her spirit somehow intact. She was no longer Eleanor Reed, the failed wife who couldn't bear children. She wasn't even Dorothy Hale, the woman who had endured 91 lashes for the crime of being barren. She was something new now, something forged in fire and pain and the unexpected kindness of a stranger. She was a woman who had looked death in the face and refused to blink. And though she didn't know it yet, she was about to discover that sometimes the end of one life is just the beginning of another. The wagon wheels turned steadily on the dusty road, carrying her away from Cedar Falls and toward a future she never could have imagined. Behind them, the town square slowly emptied as people returned to their daily routines, trying to forget what they had witnessed. But the blood on the whipping post would stain the wood for months to come, a permanent reminder of the day justice failed and mercy triumphed. In the distance, 3 children played in the yard of the Thornwood Ranch, unaware that their lives were about to change forever. Samuel, 15 and serious beyond his years, was teaching his sisters how to rope fence posts. Grace, 12 and bright as a new penny, was trying to improve on her brother's technique. And Lily, 8 and silent since her mother's death 2 years ago, watched it all with the wise eyes of someone who had seen too much sorrow for her age. None of them knew that their father had just committed an act that would make them fugitives from Reed justice. None of them knew that a broken woman was coming to their home, carrying with her the seeds of both love and danger. None of them knew that by sunset their quiet ranch would become a sanctuary for the wounded and a target for the vengeful. But they would learn. They would all learn that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with guns and anger, but with compassion and courage. They would learn that families aren't just born, they're chosen, fought for, and protected with everything you have. And in the days to come, as Dorothy healed in their home and found her place among them, they would learn that love has the power to transform even the most broken souls into something beautiful and strong. The wagon continued its journey toward the Thornwood Ranch, carrying with it the hope of redemption and the promise of a new beginning. The whipping post stood empty now, its bloody surface gleaming in the afternoon sun, but it no longer held any power over the woman who had survived its cruel embrace. Dorothy was free. Réessayer T.S. Part 2. Louis Viet Nam Chanton 2000 liên kết liên mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện pha hối thoại, tạo thành một câu chuyện liên mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liên mạch với phần trước, không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới. Liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch. Sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần, duy trì chủ đề, tránh ngắt quãng đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng hoặc tiêu đề phụ phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ Hoa Kỳ, giống văn giàu cảm xúc. Kể theo ngôi thứ ba, giữ độ kịch tính không viết lần man, kết thúc phần không giới thiệu phần sau. Lưu ý trả lời trong một tin nhắn không nhảy sang documentin, modifier tai hại. The wagon wheels had barely stopped creaking when 3 pairs of eyes appeared at the ranch house windows. Samuel Thornwood, his 15-year-old frame already showing the broad shoulders he'd inherit from his father, was the first to step onto the porch. His dark hair caught the late afternoon light as he watched his father and Dr. Morgan carefully lift the unconscious woman from the wagon bed. "Pa!" Samuel's voice carried the careful restraint of someone who'd learned too young that the world could change in an instant. What happened? Liam's jaw tightened as he supported Dorothy's weight, her blood-soaked dress leaving crimson stains on his shirt. "Help Dr. Morgan with his bag, son. We'll talk after we get her inside." Grace appeared beside her brother, her copper curls wild from an afternoon of play. At 12, she possessed their mother's quick mind and quicker tongue, though both had been tempered by loss. Her green eyes widened as she took in the woman's condition. "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph," she whispered, earning a sharp look from Samuel. "Language, Grace," he muttered, but his own face had gone pale. Dr. Morgan struggled with his medical bag, his hands shaking from the afternoon's events. "We need to get her to a bed immediately. She's lost a dangerous amount of blood." As they carried Dorothy through the front door, a small figure emerged from behind the kitchen doorway. Lily Thornwood, 8 years old, with her mother's delicate features and her father's steady gray eyes, said nothing. She hadn't spoken a word since the fever had taken their mother 2 years ago, but her silence spoke volumes. She watched the procession with the solemn intensity of someone who understood suffering intimately. The Thornwood ranch house was modest but well built, with wide plank floors and whitewashed walls that spoke of careful maintenance despite their reduced circumstances. Liam led them to the guest room, a small space that had served as his late wife's sewing room. The afternoon light filtering through gingham curtains fell across a simple iron bed that Grace had made up with fresh linens just that morning, never imagining it would soon harbor a refugee from Reed Justice. "Lay her on her stomach," Dr. Morgan instructed, his professional demeanor returning as he opened his bag. "I need to examine the damage." Liam carefully positioned Dorothy on the bed while Dr. Morgan laid out his instruments. The children hovered in the doorway until their father's gentle but firm voice sent them away. "Samuel, take your sisters to the kitchen. See about starting supper." "But Pa," Grace began. "No arguments. This isn't for children to see." Samuel understood the weight behind his father's words and ushered his sisters down the hallway, though Grace's protests could be heard long after they'd reached the kitchen. Dr. Morgan worked in grim silence, cleaning wounds that should have killed any normal person. The whip had laid Dorothy's back open in a crosshatch pattern that would scar her for life, but miraculously, no vital organs had been damaged. "She's stronger than she looks," he murmured, applying a poultice to the worst of the wounds. "Most people would have died from shock alone." Liam stood at the window watching the road that led back to town. "Reed won't let this go. You know that, don't you, Doc?" "I know." Dr. Morgan's hands never paused in their work. "But I also know I couldn't stand by and watch a woman die. My oath means something even if the law doesn't. Your oath might get you run out of town. Hell, it might get you worse than that." Dr. Morgan finished bandaging the worst of Dorothy's wounds and pulled a clean sheet over her still form. "Maybe, but I've got to live with myself, Liam, same as you." They left Dorothy to rest and joined the children in the kitchen, where Grace had managed to produce a pot of stew despite her obvious agitation. The kitchen was the heart of the Thornwood home, with a large stone fireplace that served for both cooking and warmth, and a worn oak table that had witnessed countless family meals. "Is she going to die?" Grace asked. Without preamble, her directness, a trait that often got her in trouble but served her well in moments like this. Dr. Morgan considered his words carefully. "She's badly hurt, but she's alive. That's something." Samuel ladled stew into bowls, his movements precise and economical. "What did she do to get beaten like that, I mean?" The question hung heavy in the air. Liam exchanged a look with Dr. Morgan, both men weighing how much truth children should bear. "She didn't do anything wrong," Liam finally said. "Sometimes bad things happen to good people. Sometimes the world isn't fair." "That's not an answer, Pa." Grace's voice carried the frustration of someone tired of being treated like a child. "We're not babies. We know what a whipping looks like." Lily, seated at the far end of the table, pushed her stew around her bowl without eating. Her gray eyes moved between the adults, absorbing everything even if she couldn't voice her questions. Dr. Morgan cleared his throat. "The woman's name is Dorothy. She was married to Joseph Reed, the mayor's son. They blamed her for not having children." The simple explanation fell into silence. Samuel's spoon clinked against his bowl as he set it down harder than necessary. "They whipped her for that, for not having babies. The Reeds have their own ideas about justice," Liam said grimly. "And in Cedar Falls, what they say goes." "But you stopped them," Grace said, and there was something like pride in her voice. "You made them stop." "I made them stop that particular beating, but this isn't over children. You need to understand that. By bringing Dorothy here, we've made ourselves enemies of the most powerful family in the territory." Samuel straightened in his chair, his young face taking on the determined expression that made him look so much like his father. "Then we'll deal with whatever comes. This isn't a game, son. The Reeds are bullies," Grace interrupted. "Mama always said bullies only understand one thing." "Your mama also said a lot of things about picking your battles," Liam reminded her gently. "This one might be bigger than we can handle." Dr. Morgan finished his stew and pushed back from the table. "I should get back to town. People will be asking questions and I need to be there to answer them." "Are you sure that's wise?" Liam asked. "Reed was pretty clear about his feelings on your interference." "Someone needs to tell the truth about what happened today. If I don't, Reed will spin his own version and Dorothy will be painted as everything from a witch to a whore." Dr. Morgan gathered his medical bag and coat. "I'll check on her tomorrow if I can." After the doctor left, the Thornwood family settled into their evening routine, though the presence of an unconscious woman in their guest room cast everything in a different light. Samuel tended to the livestock while Grace cleaned the kitchen, her movements more vigorous than usual as she worked through her emotions. Lily sat by the fireplace with a piece of needlework, her small fingers creating perfect stitches in the growing darkness. Liam checked on Dorothy throughout the evening, changing her bandages and monitoring her breathing. She remained unconscious, her face pale but peaceful in the lamplight. Around midnight, as he was preparing to return to his own room, she stirred. "Water," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Liam quickly poured a glass from the pitcher on the nightstand and helped her take small sips. her green eyes clouded with pain and confusion, focused on his face. Where am I? You're safe, he said simply. You're at my ranch, away from town. My name is Liam Thornwood. Memory returned in fragments, and Dorothy's hand moved instinctively to her back, wincing as the movement pulled at her wounds. The whipping, she said, and her voice carried no self-pity, only a kind of weary acceptance. You stopped them. Dr. Morgan and I stopped them. You were dying. Dorothy closed her eyes for a moment, absorbing this information. Why? The simple question carried the weight of a lifetime's worth of disappointment and betrayal. Why would strangers risk themselves for someone they barely knew? Because it was the right thing to do, Liam said, and he meant it. The right thing. Dorothy's laugh was bitter and small. I'd almost forgotten there was such a thing. Over the next few days, Dorothy drifted in and out of consciousness as her body fought to heal itself. The children took turns sitting with her when their father was working, each bringing their own form of comfort. Samuel read aloud from books of poetry and adventure stories, his young voice lending gravity to tales of heroes and distant lands. Grace chattered about ranch life, the weather, and anything else that came to mind, filling the silence with the kind of casual conversation that made the patient feel connected to the world of the living. But it was Lily's silent presence that seemed to comfort Dorothy most. The little girl would sit in the chair beside the bed for hours, working on her needlework or simply watching with those solemn gray eyes. There was an understanding between them, two souls who had been broken by circumstances beyond their control. On the fourth day, Dorothy was strong enough to sit up and take solid food. Grace had prepared a bowl of chicken broth with tiny dumplings, and she fussed over the patient like a tiny mother hen. You need to eat more, Grace insisted, spooning another dumpling into the bowl. Mama always said you can't heal on an empty stomach. Your mama sounds like she was a wise woman, Dorothy said, managing a small smile. She was. Grace's voice carried the matter-of-fact sadness of someone who had learned to live with loss. She died 2 years ago. Fever took her in just 3 days. I'm sorry. Pa says she's watching over us from heaven. I think maybe she sent you to us. Dorothy's spoon paused halfway to her mouth. Why would you think that? Because we needed someone to take care of, and you needed someone to take care of you. Mama was always practical like that. The simple wisdom of the observation struck Dorothy with unexpected force. She had spent so many years being told she was worthless, a burden, a failure, that the idea of being needed seemed almost foreign. That evening, as Dorothy sat by the window in the guest room watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Liam knocked softly on the doorframe. Mind if I come in? She gestured to the chair beside the window, and he settled his tall frame into it with the easy grace of a man comfortable in his own skin. How are you feeling? Better. The word came out stronger than she'd expected. Your children have been very kind. They're good kids. They've had to grow up fast since their mother died. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the last light fade from the sky. Finally, Dorothy spoke the question that had been weighing on her mind. What happens now? I can't stay here forever, and I can't go back to town. Liam had been thinking about the same question for days. Where would you go? Do you have family somewhere? No, my parents are dead and I have no siblings. Joseph was all I had. The admission came without self-pity, but it highlighted the impossible nature of her situation. Then you'll stay here until you're healed. After that, we'll figure something out. The Reeds won't let this stand. You know that, don't you? Every day I'm here puts you and your children in danger. Liam turned to look at her directly, his gray eyes serious in the lamplight. Dorothy, I've been thinking about what happened in town, about what kind of man stands by and watches a woman get beaten to death. I decided I don't want to be that kind of man. My children don't need to learn that lesson, even if it costs you everything. What's everything worth if you can't look at yourself in the mirror? The conversation was interrupted by a soft knock on the door. Grace peered around the corner, her copper curls escaping from the braids she'd worn to keep them neat. "Pa, there's riders coming up the road." Liam was on his feet instantly, his relaxed demeanor replaced by alert tension. "How many?" "Looks like 4 or 5. They're carrying torches." Dorothy felt ice form in her stomach. "It's them. It's the Reeds." "Maybe." Liam moved to the window and peered out at the approaching lights. "Grace, get your brother and sister. Take them to the root cellar and don't come out until I tell you." "But Pa..." "No arguments. Go, now." As Grace disappeared down the hallway, Liam turned back to Dorothy. "Can you stand?" "I think so." She rose carefully, her back protesting but holding her weight. "There's a door from this room that leads to the back porch. If things go bad, I want you to run for the barn. Samuel knows every hiding place on this ranch. He'll find you. I won't leave you to face this alone. This is my fault." "No." Liam's voice was firm. "This is about more than you now. This is about what kind of place we want Cedar Falls to be." The sound of hoofbeats grew louder, and through the window they could see the torches clearly now. 5 riders moving with the confident aggression of men who believe themselves above consequence. Liam checked his Colt .45 and moved toward the front of the house. "Remember what I said about the barn?" Dorothy watched him go, then moved to the window to observe the approaching riders. Even in the torchlight, she could make out the familiar bulk of Joseph's figure, and beside him the straight-backed authority of Mayor Reed. The other 3 men she didn't recognize, but their purpose was clear enough. The riders stopped in the yard, their horses snorting and stamping in the cool evening air. Mayor Reed's voice carried clearly through the night. "Thornwood, come out here. We need to talk." Liam emerged from the house, his rifle held casually but ready. "Evening, Reed. You're a long way from town." "Not far enough, apparently." Mayor Reed's voice held the cold authority that had cowed Cedar Falls for decades. "You have something that belongs to my son." "I don't think I do." Joseph urged his horse forward, his face flushed with anger and whiskey. "Don't play games, Thornwood. We know she's here. We want her back." "Want who back?" "My wife, Eleanor. You had no right to interfere with lawful punishment." Liam's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Lawful? You were beating a woman to death in the town square. If that's your idea of law, then maybe Cedar Falls needs a new kind of justice." "Careful, Thornwood." Mayor Reed's voice carried a warning. "You're walking a dangerous line. The only dangerous thing here is letting men like you decide what's right and wrong." One of the unknown riders, a thin man with nervous eyes, spoke up. "Maybe we should just search the place. End this quick." Liam's rifle moved slightly, not quite pointing at anyone but making its presence known. "Nobody's searching anything. This is private property." "Not anymore." Mayor Reed smiled, and it was a cold, calculated expression. "By order of the territorial marshal, this property is now under investigation for harboring a fugitive. We have every right to search it." "What fugitive?" "Eleanor Reed wanted for abandoning her lawful husband and disrupting the peace of Cedar Falls." The absurdity of the charges would have been laughable if not for the very real guns backing them up. Dorothy, listening from the window, felt a familiar rage building in her chest. These men would twist any law, create any fiction to maintain their power. She made her decision. Moving carefully to avoid reopening her wounds, Dorothy walked through the house and stepped onto the front porch. The torchlight flickered across her face as she faced the 5 mounted men. "I'm here," she said simply. Joseph's face lit up with triumph. "Eleanor, come home, now. My name is Dorothy, and I'm not going anywhere with you. You're my wife. You'll do as you're told." Dorothy straightened to her full height, ignoring the fire in her back. "I stopped being your wife the moment you tied me to that post. I stopped being Eleanor Reed the moment you decided I was worth less than livestock." Mayor Reed's voice cut through the night like a blade. "Enough of this nonsense. Boys, take her." The 3 hired men began to dismount their hands, moving to their weapons. But before they could take a step, three figures emerged from the shadows around the ranch house. Samuel appeared from behind the barn, his father's old hunting rifle trained on the nearest rider. Grace stepped out from behind the water trough holding a shotgun that looked almost too big for her small frame. And Lily, silent as always, stood at the corner of the house with a small pistol held in both hands. "I don't think so," Samuel said, his young voice steady despite the circumstances. "This lady is under our protection." Joseph laughed nervously. "Children playing with guns. How touching." "These children know how to use those guns," Liam said quietly. "Their mother made sure of that before she died, and they've got nothing to lose." The standoff stretched taut as a wire fence, 5 armed men facing a family that had decided to make its stand. In the flickering torchlight, Dorothy could see the calculation in Mayor Reed's eyes, weighing the cost of violence against the certainty of victory. It was Grace who broke the silence, her clear voice carrying across the yard with devastating simplicity. "Mama always said a man who beats women ain't much of a man at all. Looks like she was right." The words hit Joseph like a physical blow, his face flushing darker with rage and humiliation. "You little, choose your next words carefully," Liam warned, his rifle now pointing directly at Joseph's chest. "Because they might be your last." Mayor Reed recognized the moment for what it was, a tipping point that could explode into bloodshed that would echo across the territory for years to come. He raised his hand, stopping his son's angry response. "This isn't over, Thornwood. Not by a long shot. You're harboring a fugitive, and there will be consequences, legal consequences." "Let the law come," Liam replied. "Real law, not Reed law." The mayor's smile was like winter ice. "We'll see how brave you feel when the territorial marshal arrives, when your children are orphans and your ranch is sold for taxes, when Dorothy here is back where she belongs, learning proper obedience. And we'll see how brave you feel when the territorial newspapers hear about Cedar Falls justice," Dorothy said, finding her voice. "When people learn about mayors who order their daughters-in-law beaten to death for being barren, I wonder how that will play in the territorial capital." For the first time, uncertainty flickered in Mayor Reed's eyes. The territorial government was trying to attract settlers and investment, and stories of public torture wouldn't help their cause. "Come on, boys," he said, finally wheeling his horse around. "We've delivered our message." As the riders disappeared into the darkness, their torches growing smaller and smaller, the Thornwood family slowly lowered their weapons. But they all knew this was just the beginning. Dorothy sank into one of the porch chairs, the adrenaline leaving her weak and shaky. I should leave tonight. I'm bringing too much danger to your family." "No." The voice was small but clear, and everyone turned in surprise. Lily had spoken the first word she'd uttered in 2 years. "No," she repeated, looking directly at Dorothy. "You stay. You're ours now." And in that moment, surrounded by a widower and his 3 children who had risked everything to protect her, Dorothy finally understood what it meant to belong somewhere. She wasn't Eleanor Reed, the barren wife. She wasn't even Dorothy Hale, the broken woman who had endured 91 lashes. She was Dorothy Thornwood, now part of a family forged not by blood, but by choice, courage, and love. And for the first time in years, she was home.
RSAYTS Part 3. Lưu ý viết 8509 man từ liên kết liền mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện pha hội thoại, tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liền mạch với phần trước không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới. Liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch. Sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần. Duy trì chủ đề. Tránh ngắt quãng đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng hoặc tiêu đề, phụ phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ-Hoa Kỳ giống văn giàu cảm xúc. Kể theo ngôi thứ 3, giữ độ kịch tính không viết. Lành mạnh kết thúc phần không giới thiệu. Phần sau modifier, the word ours hung in the night air like a benediction, but it carried with it the weight of war.
Lily's first spoken words in 2 years had drawn a line in the dust that the Reeds would never allow to stand unchallenged. As the family gathered their weapons and retreated into the house, each of them understood that their quiet ranch had become the epicenter of something much larger than one woman's freedom. Dorothy watched Lily disappear into the kitchen, the little girl's brief moment of speech already retreating back into silence. But something had shifted in those gray eyes, a recognition that family wasn't just about blood or law, it was about choosing to stand together when the world demanded you stand apart. "She hasn't spoken since Margaret died," Liam said quietly, settling his rifle against the wall by the front door. "The doctor said it was shock, that maybe someday—" He trailed off, watching his youngest daughter through the doorway. "I never thought it would be for a stranger." "I'm not a stranger anymore," Dorothy replied, and the truth of it surprised her. 3 weeks ago she had been Eleanor Reed, invisible and worthless. Tonight she was Dorothy Thornwood, worth fighting for. Samuel positioned himself at the front window, his young face grim with responsibility beyond his years. "They'll be back, won't they, Pa? Tomorrow, most likely. Reed won't let tonight's humiliation stand." Liam moved through the house, checking the locks on doors and windows. "Grace, help me move the furniture. We need to barricade the windows on the ground floor." "What about the territorial marshal?" Grace asked as she helped her father drag a heavy chest of drawers across the parlor. "Mayor Reed seemed pretty confident about that." Dorothy felt her stomach tighten. "He has connections throughout the territory. Judges, marshals, politicians, they all owe him favors. If he wants me declared a fugitive, he can make it happen." "Then we need to get ahead of him," Samuel said, his rifle never wavering from the window. "Send word to the territorial capital ourselves. Tell our side of the story." Liam paused in his work, considering his eldest son's words. "That might work if we can find someone willing to carry the message. Most of the riders around here are afraid of crossing Reed." "What about Mr. Peterson?" Grace suggested. "He trades with the Sioux Travels all over the territory. Reed can't touch him." "Old Henrik might do it," Liam agreed, "but his trading post is 15 miles north, and these roads won't be safe for any of us now." Dorothy stood carefully, her healing back protesting the movement. "I'll go. Peterson doesn't know me, and Reed's people won't be watching for a woman traveling alone." "Absolutely not." Liam's voice carried the authority of a father and the protectiveness of a man who had already lost too much. "You can barely stand, let alone ride 15 miles over rough country." "I can stand," Dorothy said firmly, "and I can ride. More importantly, I'm the one they want. If Reed's people are out there, they'll be looking for someone trying to sneak away from the ranch, not someone riding boldly toward Peterson's place." Samuel turned from the window, his expression thoughtful. "She might be right, Pa. Sometimes the best place to hide is in plain sight. It's too dangerous. If they catch you, if they catch me, I'm no worse off than I was 3 weeks ago," Dorothy interrupted. "But if I don't try, we're all trapped here waiting for Reed to bring enough guns to finish what he started." The debate was cut short by the sound of hoofbeats approaching from the south. Samuel tensed at the window, his finger finding the trigger of his rifle. "Just one rider," he reported, moving slow like he doesn't want to spook anyone. Liam grabbed his Colt and moved to the front door, calling out into the darkness. "That's far enough, friend. State your business." "It's Dr. Morgan," came the familiar voice. "I need to talk to you, Liam. It's important." They opened the door to find the doctor dismounting from his horse, his medical bag slung over his shoulder and his face drawn with exhaustion. He looked like a man who had spent the day fighting a losing battle. "Doc, what are you doing out here so late?" Liam asked, ushering him inside. Dr. Morgan accepted a cup of coffee from Grace and settled heavily into a chair by the fireplace. "Reed's been busy since your little confrontation. He's got Judge Hamilton to issue a warrant for Dorothy's arrest, charging her with abandoning her lawful husband and disturbing the peace." "On what evidence?" Dorothy demanded. "Evidence doesn't matter when you own the judge. Hamilton owes Reed money, lots of it. a gambling debt that could ruin him if it ever came to light. Dr. Morgan's voice carried the bitter wisdom of a man who had seen too much corruption. Reeds also sent word to the territorial marshal in Cheyenne. He's claiming you're part of a gang of criminals who've taken over the Thornwood Ranch. Samuel let out a low whistle. A gang of criminals, us. According to Reed's version, you're all dangerous fugitives who threaten the lives of peace officers. The marshals already dispatched a company of soldiers to deal with the situation. The implications hit them like a physical blow. Federal soldiers meant federal authority, and federal authority meant the kind of force that could crush their small resistance without a second thought. "How long do we have?" Liam asked quietly. 3 days, maybe 4. The soldiers are coming from Fort Laramie, and the roads are bad this time of year. Dr. Morgan leaned forward, his voice urgent. But there's something else. Reed's not waiting for the soldiers. He's hiring guns, bringing in men from outside the territory. Word is he plans to end this before the federal authorities arrive. "End it how?" Grace asked, though the answer was written in the grim lines of the doctor's face. "By making sure there's nobody left to contradict his story when the soldiers get here." The silence that followed was heavy, with the weight of impossible choices. Fight and die, or surrender Dorothy to certain death. Neither option offered hope. It was Lily who broke the silence, her small voice cutting through the despair like a blade of light. "Uncle Henrik," she said, looking directly at her father. "Mama's stories." Liam's eyes widened with sudden understanding. "Of course! Henrik Peterson isn't just a traitor, he's Margaret's brother. He's family." Dorothy looked between them confused. "I thought you said Peterson was just someone who might carry a message." "Henrik is more than that," Liam explained, his voice gaining strength. "He was Margaret's brother, which makes him the children's uncle. But more than that, he's got connections throughout the territory. Other traders, Sioux chiefs, even some politicians in Cheyenne who owe him favors." Dr. Morgan nodded slowly. "Henrik Peterson's not just any trader. He's one of the most respected men on the frontier. If he vouches for your story, people will listen." "But how do we get to him?" Samuel asked. "Like you said, the roads aren't safe." Grace stood up suddenly, her face animated with an idea. "The old mining trail, the one that runs along Bear Creek. It's rough, but it cuts the distance in half, and Reed's people won't know about it." "That trail hasn't been used in years," Liam protested. "It's probably washed out in places." "Maybe, but it's better than trying to take the main road with Reed's guns waiting." Dorothy moved to the window, staring out at the darkness. "I still think I should go alone. One person has a better chance of getting through than a group." "Nobody goes alone," Liam said firmly. "If we're doing this, we do it together." "All of us?" Dr. Morgan asked. "Even the children, especially the children. If Reed's planning what I think he's planning, this ranch won't be safe for anyone when the sun comes up." They spent the next hour planning their escape, spreading maps across the kitchen table and plotting a route that would take them through some of the roughest country in the territory. The old mining trail followed Bear Creek through a series of canyons and ridges that would provide cover, but also present dangers of their own. "We'll need supplies for at least 3 days," Samuel said, already mentally cataloging what they would need. "Food, water, ammunition, medical supplies in case Dorothy's wounds reopen." "I can manage," Dorothy insisted, though privately she wondered if her healing body could endure the kind of journey they were planning. "We'll take it slow," Liam decided. "Better to arrive alive than not arrive at all." Dr. Morgan stood to leave, his face heavy with the knowledge of what was coming. "I'll do what I can to delay Reed, maybe spread some rumors about where you've gone. But once you leave, you can't come back. Not until this is settled one way or another." "We understand," Liam said, shaking the doctor's hand. "Thank you, Samuel, for everything. Thank me by staying alive and by making sure the truth gets told." After the doctor left, the family threw themselves into preparations with the kind of desperate efficiency that comes from knowing your life depends on getting the details right. They packed light, but carefully taking only what was essential for survival. Samuel and Liam checked their weapons and ammunition, while Grace gathered food and medical supplies. Lily, still mostly silent but clearly understanding the gravity of their situation, helped Dorothy pack a small bag of clothes. As dawn approached, they were ready. 5 horses stood saddled in the barn, their breath visible in the cold morning air. Dorothy's mare was the gentlest of the bunch, chosen specifically to minimize the strain on her healing back. "Remember," Liam said as they prepared to mount up, "we stick together no matter what. If one of us falls behind, we all fall behind. Nobody gets left behind." They rode out just as the first pink light of dawn touched the eastern horizon, taking a circuitous route through their own pasture lands before picking up the old mining trail near Bear Creek. The trail was indeed rough, little more than a game path in places, but it led them steadily north through country that few people knew well. For the first few hours they made good time. Dorothy's back ached constantly, but she gritted her teeth and kept pace with the others. The children rode with the easy confidence of people who had grown up in the saddle, while Liam constantly scanned their surroundings for signs of pursuit. It was Samuel who spotted the smoke first, a thin column rising from the direction of their ranch. "Pa," he said quietly, pointing back toward the south. They all turned to look, and Dorothy felt her heart sink. The smoke was too thick, too black to be coming from a chimney or cook fire. Someone was burning something large. "The house," Grace asked, her voice small. "Maybe just the barn," Liam said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Reed wants to send a message. This is how he sends it." They watched their home burn from a distance, each of them processing the loss in their own way. For the children, it was the final destruction of their childhood, the place where their mother had lived and loved and died. For Liam, it was the end of the life he had built. With Margaret, the dreams they had shared for their future. For Dorothy, it was something else entirely. She was watching a family sacrifice everything they had built for a woman they had known for less than a month. The guilt was almost overwhelming. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." "Don't," Liam said firmly. "Don't you dare apologize for Reed's actions. This is his choice, not yours. But if you hadn't come, we'd still be living in a world where men like Reed can beat women to death in the town square," Samuel interrupted. "Maybe it's time that world burned down." They pressed on the smoke from their burning home, serving as a constant reminder of what they had lost and what they still stood to lose. The trail grew rougher as the day wore on, forcing them to dismount and lead their horses through particularly treacherous sections. By midday, Dorothy was struggling. The constant jarring of the saddle had reopened some of her wounds, and she could feel blood seeping through her bandages. But she said nothing, determined not to slow their escape. It was Lily who noticed first, her sharp eyes catching the red stains on Dorothy's shirt. "Blood," she said, simply pointing. Liam immediately called a halt, helping Dorothy down from her horse and examining her wounds. Several of the deeper lashes had indeed reopened, and her shirt was soaked with blood. "We need to stop and rebandage these," he said, opening their medical supplies. "We don't have time," Dorothy protested. "Reed's people could be following us." "We don't have time for you to bleed to death either," Grace said practically. "Besides, if you fall off your horse, we'll have to stop anyway." They found shelter in a grove of cottonwoods beside Bear Creek, where Liam carefully cleaned and rebandaged Dorothy's wounds, while the children kept watch. The brief rest allowed them all to catch their breath and eat some of the food Grace had packed. "How much farther?" Dorothy asked, as Liam finished tying off the last bandage. "Maybe 10 more miles to Peterson's trading post, but this next stretch is the worst part of the trail. Rocky country, easy to lose your footing." As if to underscore his words, the sound of gunshots echoed from somewhere behind them, distant but unmistakable. Reed's searchers were out there working their way north along the various trails that led away from Cedar Falls. "Time to go," Samuel said, helping Dorothy back onto her horse. The afternoon brought new challenges as the trail climbed into the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. The path was narrow and treacherous, winding along cliff faces that dropped away into deep canyons. In several places they had to dismount and lead their horses single file along ledges barely wide enough for one animal. Dorothy found herself fighting waves of dizziness as the blood loss and physical exertion took their toll. More than once she had to grab her saddle horn to keep from falling, but she continued without complaint. It was during one of these difficult passages that they heard the sound of horses somewhere behind them. The acoustics of the canyon made it impossible to tell how far away their pursuers were, but the sound was definitely getting closer. "How many?" Liam asked Samuel, who had the best hearing among them. "Hard to say, maybe 6 or 8 horses, moving fast." They were still 3 miles from Peterson's trading post, with the most difficult section of trail still ahead of them. If Reed's men caught them in the canyons, there would be nowhere to run and limited places to make a stand. "There's a side canyon about a mile ahead," Liam said, his voice calm despite the circumstances. "We can try to hide there, let them pass." But as they reached the junction with the side canyon, they could see it was a dead end, terminating in a sheer rock wall after only a few hundred yards. It would be a trap rather than a hiding place. "Keep going," Dorothy said, her voice stronger than she felt. "If we can reach Peterson's place, we'll have help. And if we can't," Dorothy's hand moved to the small pistol Liam had given her that morning, "then we make our stand where we choose to make it." The sound of pursuit grew louder as they pushed their tired horses along the final stretch of trail. The trading post was visible now, a cluster of log buildings nestled in a valley where Bear Creek met a larger river. Smoke rose from the chimneys and they could see people moving around the buildings. But between them and safety lay the most dangerous part of the journey, a narrow bridge spanning a deep gorge with no room for retreat if they were caught in the middle. "One at a time," Liam decided. "Lily first, then Grace, then Dorothy. Samuel and I will bring up the rear." Lily urged her pony onto the bridge, her small form steady and fearless as she crossed the span that would have terrified most adults. Grace followed, her copper hair streaming behind her as her horse's hooves rang against the wooden planks. Dorothy was halfway across when the first of their pursuers appeared at the top of the trail behind them. She could see Joseph Reed's distinctive figure among the riders, along with several men she didn't recognize. Hard-faced strangers with guns and no scruples about using them. "There," Joseph's voice carried clearly across the distance. "Don't let them reach the trading post." The first shots rang out as Dorothy reached the far side of the bridge, bullets whining off the rock walls of the canyon. Samuel's horse shied at the sound, nearly throwing him from the saddle, but he managed to stay mounted and keep moving. Liam was the last to cross, and as his horse's hooves touched solid ground on the far side, he turned and put 2 quick shots into the bridge's support ropes. The ancient wooden structure groaned and swayed, but held. "Warning shots," he called across the gorge to Reed's men. "The next ones won't be—" Joseph Reed spurred his horse to the edge of the bridge, his face purple with rage. "You can't run forever, Thornwood. We'll find another way across." "Maybe you will," Liam replied calmly. "But you'll have to explain to Henrik Peterson why you're shooting at his nieces and nephew first." The name Peterson had the desired effect. Even Joseph Reed knew better than to cross one of the most influential traders in the territory. The pursuers pulled back from the bridge, though they made no move to leave the area entirely. As the Thornwood family and Dorothy approached the trading post, they could see Henrik Peterson himself emerging from the main building. He was a bear of a man, tall and broad, with graying blonde hair and the kind of weathered face that spoke of decades on the frontier. His pale blue eyes took in the approaching riders and the armed men on the far side of the gorge with the quick assessment of someone who had survived by reading situations accurately. Liam Thornwood, he called out in accented English, his Norwegian heritage still evident after 30 years in America. You look like a man with troubles. Henrik, Liam replied, dismounting and helping Dorothy down from her horse. We need your help, and we need to tell you a story that's going to be hard to believe. Peterson's eyes moved to Dorothy, taking in her obvious injuries and exhausted condition, then to his nieces and nephew, noting their grim expressions and the way they stayed close together like soldiers who had been through battle. Any story that brings Joseph Reed and hired guns to my doorstep is a story worth hearing, he said simply. Come inside, all of you, and let an old traitor decide what's to be done about Reed justice and frontier law. As they walked toward the safety of the trading post, Dorothy realized that this was the moment everything would be decided. Henrik Peterson held the power to either save them or deliver them back to Reed's vengeance. And somewhere across the gorge, Joseph Reed waited with his guns and his hatred, ready to finish what he had started at the whipping post in Cedar Falls. The final confrontation was coming, and Dorothy found herself no longer afraid. She had discovered something in the past month that was stronger than fear, stronger than pain, stronger even than the law itself. She had found family, and she was ready to fight for it with everything she had left. Reyes T.S. Part 4. Louis Viet 9000 Tan 9500 2 liên kết liên mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện pha hội thoại, tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liền mạch với phần trước không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới, liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch. Sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần, duy trì chủ đề, tránh ngắt quãng đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng hoặc tiêu đề phụ phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ Hoa Kỳ giống văn giàu cảm xúc. Kể theo ngôi thứ ba, giữ độ kịch tính không viết. Lan man kết thúc phần không giới thiệu phần sau. Modifier, the interior of Henrik Peterson's trading post, was a study in organized chaos, with goods from across the territory stacked floor to ceiling along the walls. Buffalo hides hung beside bolts of calico, while barrels of flour stood next to crates of ammunition. The scent of tobacco, leather, and wood smoke filled the air, creating an atmosphere that spoke of honest commerce and frontier hospitality. Peterson led them to a large room behind the main store where a stone fireplace dominated one wall and a massive oak table occupied the center. He gestured for them to sit while his Sioux wife Sarah emerged from the kitchen with coffee and bread still warm from the oven. Now then, Peterson said, settling his considerable bulk into a chair that groaned under his weight, tell me why Joseph Reed is willing to bring guns to my doorstep. Liam began the story, his voice steady and factual, as he described the events in Cedar Falls. Peterson listened without interruption, his pale blue eyes moving between the speakers as Grace and Samuel added their own perspectives. When Dorothy finally spoke, describing her marriage to Joseph and the morning at the whipping post, Peterson's jaw tightened with barely controlled anger. 100 lashes, he said quietly when she finished. For being barren. 91, Dorothy corrected. Mr. Thornwood stopped them before they could finish. Peterson stood and walked to the window facing the gorge, where Joseph Reed's men could still be seen waiting on the far side. Joseph always was a mean little boy. I remember when he was 12, he tried to burn down my warehouse because I wouldn't give him free candy. His father paid for the damage and promised it wouldn't happen again. Looks like some promises don't keep very well, Samuel observed. No, Peterson agreed. They don't. He turned back to face them, his expression grim. But this is bigger than Joseph's meanness. Harrison Reed has been building his little kingdom for 20 years, and he's not going to let anyone challenge his authority, especially not over something as public as this. Sarah Peterson approached Dorothy with a basin of warm water and clean bandages. Let me see to your wounds, child. Men like to talk, but women know when to act. As Sarah gently cleaned and rebandaged Dorothy's reopened wounds, Peterson continued his assessment. Reed's got Judge Hamilton in his pocket. That's true enough, but Judge Hamilton's got his own problems. Word's been spreading about his gambling, and the territorial governor's been asking questions. What kind of questions? Liam asked. The kind that could get a judge removed from office. Hamilton's been taking bribes for years, not just from Reed. The governor's office has been building a case against him, waiting for the right moment to act. Grace looked up from her bread and coffee. So maybe Reed's warrant isn't as solid as he thinks. Legal warrants are one thing, Peterson replied. But Reed's not relying on legal warrants anymore. He's hired professional killers, men who don't care about judges or territories or anything except the money in their pockets. As if summoned by his words, the sound of gunshots echoed from across the gorge. Peterson moved quickly to the window, cursing in Norwegian, as he saw what was happening. "They're shooting at my bridge," he growled, "trying to weaken the support cables so they can cross." Samuel joined him at the window, his young face hard with determination. "How long before they bring it down? Those cables are steel," Peterson said with grim satisfaction. "They'll need more than rifle fire to cut through them, but they might try dynamite if they're desperate enough." "Do they have dynamite?" Dorothy asked, though she already suspected the answer. "Reed owns the biggest mine in the territory. He's got access to all the explosives he wants." The reality of their situation was becoming clear. Reed's men couldn't cross the bridge as long as it stood, but they could destroy it and find another way around. The trading post was defensible, but not against a determined assault by professional gunmen. "There is another way," Peterson said slowly, as if the idea was forming even as he spoke. "But it's dangerous, and it means trusting people you've never met." "What kind of way?" Liam asked. Peterson walked to a large map hanging on the wall, pointing to a network of trails that wound through the mountains north of the trading post. "The Sioux have hunting camps in these hills. Chief Running Bear owes me favors going back 15 years. His warriors could escort you safely to the territorial capital, but it means traveling through country where white families aren't always welcome, and it means putting your lives in the hands of people Reed would call savages." Dorothy stood carefully, her freshly bandaged wounds protesting the movement. "What do you call them?" Peterson smiled for the first time since they'd arrived. "I call them the finest horsemen and warriors on the continent, and some of the most honorable people I've ever known." "Then we go," Dorothy said simply. "When, tonight, if we're lucky, Sarah can send word to Running Bear's camp. If he agrees to help, his men will come for you after dark." The afternoon passed in tense preparation. Sarah Peterson proved to be a woman of remarkable capability, not only tending to Dorothy's wounds, but also preparing supplies for their continued journey. She packed food that would travel well, along with blankets and medical supplies that might be needed in the wilderness. "My Sarah lived with the Sioux for 5 years before we married," Peterson explained as his wife worked with quiet efficiency. "She knows their ways, speaks their language. If anyone can convince Running Bear to help, it's her." As evening approached, Peterson posted men at strategic points around the trading post while keeping watch on Reed's forces across the gorge. The hired gunmen had made several attempts to damage the bridge cables, but without success. Their frustration was evident in the increasingly wild shots they sent across the water. "They're getting desperate," Peterson observed as another volley of bullets ricocheted off the stone walls of his buildings. "Desperate men make mistakes." It was Lily who spotted the Sioux warriors first, her sharp eyes catching movement in the trees on the hillside above the trading post. She tugged on her father's sleeve and pointed her silence as eloquent as any words. "They're here," Peterson said with satisfaction. "Running Bear doesn't waste time when friends are in trouble." The Sioux arrived like shadows, materializing out of the darkness with the kind of stealth that made them legendary throughout the territory. Chief Running Bear himself was a man of perhaps 50 years, tall and lean, with graying black hair and eyes that seemed to see everything. He spoke briefly with Sarah Peterson in the Lakota language before turning his attention to the white family that had requested his help. My friend Henrik tells me you fight against the man who beats women, he said in carefully pronounced English. This is a fight we understand. Liam stepped forward, offering his hand in the white man's gesture of greeting. We're grateful for any help you can give us, Chief, but we don't want to bring trouble to your people. Running Bear's weathered face creased in what might have been a smile. Trouble comes whether we invite it or not. Better to choose the trouble that serves honor. The plan the chief outlined was both simple and dangerous. His warriors would escort the Thornwood family and Dorothy through the mountain passes to a point near the territorial capital, staying off the main roads and avoiding the areas where Reed's influence was strongest. The journey would take 4 days through some of the roughest country in the territory, but it would get them to safety. What about Reed's men? Samuel asked, gesturing toward the far side of the gorge. Reed's men will follow, Running Bear said matter-of-factly. But they do not know these mountains as we do. They will become lost, and while they search for the wrong trails, you will reach safety. As the family prepared to leave with their Sioux escorts, Peterson pulled Liam aside for a private word. There's something else you need to know, he said quietly. I've been in contact with people in the territorial capital. Politicians, businessmen, people who've been watching Reed's activities with growing concern. This situation with Dorothy might be exactly the excuse they need to move against him. What do you mean? I mean Reed's made enemies over the years. People he's cheated, threatened, or simply stepped on in his climb to power. If they can prove he's been corrupting local officials and using violence to maintain control, they can remove him from office and clean house in Cedar Falls. Liam felt a spark of hope for the first time in days. And you think Dorothy's testimony could provide that proof? I think Dorothy's testimony, combined with what I know about Reed's business dealings and what others are willing to say about his methods, could bring down his entire operation. As they prepared to depart, Dorothy took a moment to thank Sarah Peterson for her kindness. The Sioux woman pressed a small leather pouch into Dorothy's hands. Medicine, she said simply, for pain, for healing. The plants know what bodies need. The journey through the mountains began under a canopy of stars that seemed close enough to touch. The Sioux warriors moved like ghosts through the darkness, following trails that were invisible to white eyes but clearly marked in their memory. Dorothy rode between Liam and Samuel, surrounded by protectors who had risked everything to keep her safe. As they climbed higher into the mountains, the air grew thin and cold. Dorothy's wounds ached constantly, but Sarah Peterson's medicine helped dull the worst of the pain. More importantly, she found strength in the quiet determination of her companions. Grace rode with the fearless confidence of someone half her age, while Lily's silence had taken on a peaceful quality that spoke of growing security. On the second day of their mountain journey, they encountered the first sign of pursuit. One of Running Bear's scouts reported seeing smoke from campfires in the valley behind them, too many fires for a normal hunting party or trading expedition. Reed's men, the chief confirmed. Perhaps 20 riders moving slowly because they do not know the way. Will they catch us? Grace asked, though her voice carried more curiosity than fear. They will try, Running Bear replied. But the mountains have many ways to slow down those who do not belong here. That afternoon, as they rested beside a mountain stream, Dorothy overheard Running Bear giving instructions to several of his warriors in the Lakota language. Sarah Peterson, who had insisted on accompanying them partway, translated quietly. He's sending men to create false trails to lead Reed's people in the wrong direction. They'll also block some of the passes behind us, making it harder for anyone to follow. Won't that put your husband's men in danger? Dorothy asked. Sarah's smile was fierce and proud. These warriors have been fighting white soldiers and cavalry for decades. A handful of hired gunmen don't frighten them. By the third day, they had climbed high enough into the mountains to see vast stretches of the territory spread out below them. The view was breathtaking, but it also revealed the scope of Reed's power. From their vantage point, they could see the smoke from his mines, the geometric patterns of his farms, the roads and towns that bore his influence. "He really does own most of this territory," Samuel observed. "For now," Dorothy replied, and there was something new in her voice, not just determination, but the kind of quiet confidence that comes from knowing you're fighting for something larger than yourself. That evening, as they camped in a sheltered valley beside a clear mountain lake, Chief Running Bear approached Dorothy where she sat by the fire, carefully cleaning her wounds with Sarah Peterson's medicine. "You are stronger than you know," he said, settling beside her with the easy grace of someone comfortable in the wilderness. "I don't feel strong. Most of the time I feel like I'm barely holding on." "Strength is not the absence of fear or pain," the chief said quietly. "Strength is continuing to move forward, despite fear and pain. You have been moving forward for many days now." Dorothy considered his words as she watched the firelight dance across the faces of the Thornwood children. Samuel was cleaning his rifle with the methodical care of someone who understood that his family's survival might depend on his weapon functioning properly. Grace was mending a tear in Lily's dress, her needle moving with quick, sure strokes, and Lily herself sat close to Dorothy working on a piece of beadwork with the kind of focused concentration that spoke of healing. "They're not even my children," Dorothy said softly. "Not really, but I'd die for them." "Blood does not make family," Running Bear replied. "Choice makes family. They have chosen you and you have chosen them. This is stronger than blood." On the fourth morning, they reached the final ridge before beginning their descent toward the territorial capital. The city spread out below them like a promise, its buildings and streets representing law and order and the possibility of justice. But between them and safety lay the most dangerous part of their journey. Open country where Reed's influence was strong and hiding places were scarce. "From here you travel alone," Running Bear said, as his warriors prepared to turn back toward their mountain strongholds. "But you do not travel unprotected. Friends wait for you in the city below, friends who have been preparing for this day." As they said goodbye to their Sioux protectors, Dorothy realized how much had changed since that terrible morning at the whipping post. She was no longer the broken woman who had hung unconscious from bloody ropes waiting to die. She was someone who had been tested by fire and found herself capable of more than she had ever imagined. The descent from the mountains took most of the day, following winding roads that gradually widened from mountain trails to proper wagon routes. As they drew closer to the territorial capital, they began to encounter other travelers, merchants, settlers, officials conducting territorial business. To outside observers, they looked like an ordinary family traveling to the city, perhaps to conduct business or visit relatives. But Dorothy could feel the weight of their true purpose with every mile. Somewhere behind them, Reed's men were still searching, still hunting. And ahead of them lay a confrontation that would determine not just her own fate, but the future of justice in the entire territory. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, they reached the outskirts of the territorial capital. The city was larger than Dorothy had expected, with broad streets lined with substantial buildings that spoke of growth and prosperity. Gas lamps were beginning to flicker to life, and the sound of evening activity filled the air. "Where do we go first?" Samuel asked as they made their way through the increasingly busy streets. "The governor's mansion," Liam replied, consulting a piece of paper Henrik Peterson had given him. "Peterson's friend is expecting us." The governor's mansion stood on a hill overlooking the rest of the city, its imposing facade lit by dozens of windows that glowed warmly in the gathering dusk. As they approached the front gate, a man in a dark suit emerged from the shadows. "Mr. Thornwood," he said quietly, "my name is James Crawford. I'm the Territorial Attorney General. We've been expecting you." Crawford was a man of perhaps 40 years with the kind of sharp intelligence that showed in his eyes and the careful way he chose his words. He ushered them quickly through the mansion's front door and into a private study where a fire crackled in the hearth, and the smell of tobacco and leather spoke of serious men conducting serious business. "You've had quite a journey," Crawford said, as they settled into comfortable chairs. "Henrik Peterson's messages reached us yesterday, along with some very interesting information about conditions in Cedar Falls." "What kind of information?" Dorothy asked. Crawford opened a thick folder on his desk, revealing documents, photographs, and what appeared to be sworn statements. "Information about Judge Hamilton's gambling debts and the favors he's been selling. Information about Reed's business practices, including his use of intimidation and violence against competitors, and information about the systematic corruption of local law enforcement in his territory." Grace leaned forward in her chair. "You mean other people have been complaining about the Reeds more than you might imagine, but until now no one has been willing to come forward publicly. Fear has a way of keeping people silent, especially when the person they fear controls the local courts and law enforcement." Crawford turned his attention to Dorothy, his expression grave but compassionate. "Mrs. Reed, or do you prefer Mrs. Hale, your testimony about what happened in Cedar Falls could be the key to bringing down an entire network of corruption. But I need you to understand what you're facing. Reed has friends in high places, people who owe him money or favors. This won't be easy." "Nothing about my life has been easy for a long time," Dorothy replied. "But these people risked everything to save me. The least I can do is tell the truth about what happened." "There's something else," Crawford continued. "We have reason to believe Reed is planning something desperate. Our sources suggest he's not just trying to recapture you, he's planning to eliminate everyone who can testify against him." The implications of this statement hit them like a physical blow. Reed wasn't just hunting Dorothy anymore, he was hunting all of them. "What do you mean, eliminate?" Samuel asked, though his young face suggested he already understood the answer. "I mean, he's decided that dead witnesses can't testify. We believe he's hired professional killers, men who specialize in making people disappear without a trace." Liam's hand moved instinctively to his gun. "Then we need protection." "You have it," Crawford assured him. "Federal marshals are stationed throughout the city, and the governor has authorized the use of territorial militia if necessary. But more than that, you have something Reed didn't expect: public opinion." Crawford walked to the window and gestured toward the street below, where crowds of people were gathering despite the late hour. "Word of your story has been spreading throughout the territory. Newspapers in 3 cities have picked up the story of the woman who was nearly beaten to death for being barren. People are outraged and they're demanding answers." Dorothy moved to join him at the window, looking down at the faces of strangers who had somehow learned of her ordeal. Many of them were women, but there were men too, and even families with children. They carried signs demanding justice and calling for Reed's removal from office. "They're here for you," Crawford said quietly. "They're here because your story represents something larger than one woman's suffering. It represents the choice between civilization and barbarism, between justice and the rule of the strong over the weak." As Dorothy looked down at the crowd, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years. The sense that she mattered, that her voice had power, that her suffering might serve a purpose larger than itself. But even as hope bloomed in her chest, the sound of gunshots echoed from somewhere in the distance. Reed's final gambit was beginning, and the ultimate confrontation was at hand. The battle for justice in the territory was about to begin, and Dorothy realized she was no longer just a victim seeking safety. She was a symbol of resistance, a woman who had refused to stay broken, and a voice that would not be silenced. Tomorrow would bring the fight of her life, but tonight, surrounded by the family she had chosen and the friends who had risked everything to protect her, Dorothy Thornwood was ready for whatever came next.
Re-S-A-R-T-S Part 5. Lưu ý viết tăng từ liên kết liền mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện pha hội thoại, tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liền mạch với phần trước không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới. liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch, sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần, duy trì chủ đề, tránh ngắt quãng đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng hoặc tiêu đề phụ. Phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ Hoa Kỳ, dòng văn giàu cảm xúc. Kể theo ngôi thứ ba, giữ độ kịch tính không viết. Lãng mạn kết thúc phần không giới thiệu. Phần sau, Modifier the gunshots grew closer as the night deepened, echoing off the stone buildings of the territorial capital like thunder rolling through a canyon. Crawford moved quickly to the window, pulling the heavy curtains closed while barking orders to someone in the hallway outside. "Federal Marshals, positions 2 and 7, he called out. "And get word to Colonel Matthews. We may need those militia units sooner than expected." Dorothy felt the familiar chill of fear creep up her spine, but it was different now. This wasn't the helpless terror of a woman tied to a whipping post. This was the sharp, focused fear of someone who had something precious to protect. "How many men does Reed have?" Liam asked, checking his Colt while Samuel did the same with his rifle. "Our best estimate is about 30 hired guns plus whatever local support he can muster," Crawford replied grimly. "But they're professionals, men who've fought in range wars and Indian campaigns. They know their business." Grace moved to stand beside Dorothy at the window, her young face set with determination that would have made her mother proud. "We've come this far. We're not backing down now." "No one's asking you to back down," Crawford said, his voice gentle but firm. "But this is no longer just about keeping you safe. Reed's declared war on the territorial government itself. By attacking you here under federal protection, he's committing treason." The sound of rapid footsteps in the hallway announced the arrival of a federal marshal, a lean man with graying hair, and the kind of weathered face that spoke of years spent enforcing law in lawless places. He nodded briefly to Crawford before addressing the room. "Marshal Henderson, sir. Reed's forces have taken positions around the city center. They've got the courthouse surrounded and they're demanding the immediate release of Mrs. Reed into their custody." "On what authority?" Crawford demanded. "They're claiming to act under a federal warrant signed by Judge Hamilton. Of course, Hamilton has no federal jurisdiction, but they're not exactly concerned with legal niceties." Dorothy stepped forward, her voice steady despite the chaos erupting around them. "What do they want from me, really?" Marshal Henderson's expression was grim. "Dead or alive, ma'am, though I suspect Reed would prefer dead at this point. You know too much, and you've become too much of a symbol for his enemies." As if summoned by his words, the crowd outside began to chant Dorothy's name, their voices rising and falling like a tide of human emotion. She moved back to the window, peering through a gap in the curtains at the faces below. What she saw took her breath away. The crowd had grown to hundreds of people, and they weren't just calling for justice anymore. They were calling for her Dorothy Thornwood, the woman who had survived Reed's cruelty and refused to be silenced. Women held signs demanding protection for all wives, while men called for an end to the corruption that had allowed Reed to rule through fear for so long. "They don't even know me," she whispered, overwhelmed by the display of support. "They know what you represent," Lily said quietly, and everyone turned to look at the 8-year-old who continued to surprise them with her wisdom. "You're proof that broken things can heal, that scared people can be brave." Before anyone could respond, the sound of splintering wood echoed from somewhere in the mansion, followed by shouts and the distinctive crack of rifle fire. Reed's men had found a way inside. Crawford drew his pistol while Marshal Henderson moved to the door, listening intently to the sounds of battle below. "They've breached the servants' entrance," he reported. "Probably 6 or 8 men. My people are engaging them, but there may be more coming." Liam gathered his children close while keeping his weapon ready. "Is there another way out of here?" "Service stairs leading to the kitchen, but that's where the fighting is," Crawford replied. "Or the main staircase to the front hall, but Reed's got that covered from outside." "What about the roof?" Samuel asked, his 15-year-old mind working through possibilities with the kind of tactical thinking that impressed the adults. Henderson nodded approvingly. "Smart boy.
There's a widow's walk that connects to the building next door. From there, you could reach the street behind the mansion." "And then what?" Grace demanded. "Keep running, forever hide, while Reed burns down half the territory looking for us." Her question hung in the air as the sound of gunfire grew closer. Through the study door, they could hear Marshal Henderson's men shouting orders and taking defensive positions throughout the mansion. It was Dorothy who broke the silence, her voice carrying a strength that surprised even her. "No more running," she said simply. "I'm done being hunted like an animal. If Reed wants me, he can face me directly." "Dorothy, that's suicide," Liam protested. "These men are killers." "So was the man who tied me to that whipping post," she replied. "But I survived that and I'll survive this. The difference is, this time I'm not alone." As if to emphasize her point, the chanting from the crowd outside grew louder. The people of the territory had found their voice, and they were demanding justice not just for Dorothy, but for everyone who had suffered under Reed's rule. Crawford holstered his weapon and moved to his desk, pulling out a document that bore the official seal of the territorial government. "There is another option," he said slowly, "but it's dangerous and it requires perfect timing." "What kind of option?" Dorothy asked. "A public confrontation, a formal challenge to Reed's authority, witnessed by the crowd outside and recorded by the newspaper reporters who have been following this story." Crawford's eyes were bright with the possibility. "If we can get Reed to show himself to make his accusations and threats in public, we can arrest him for treason and sedition." Marshal Henderson shook his head. "That's assuming he's willing to talk instead of just shooting everyone in sight." "Reed's not stupid," Crawford continued. "He knows that if he kills federal officials and civilians in front of hundreds of witnesses, he'll have the entire U.S. Army hunting him down. But if he can make this look like a legal arrest gone wrong, he might still salvage something from this situation." The sound of footsteps on the stairs outside the study made everyone tense, but it was only another federal marshal bringing news from the street. "Sir Reed himself has arrived. He's got about 20 men with him, and he's demanding to speak with the Attorney General. Says he has legal papers that supersede federal authority." Crawford smiled grimly. "Then let's give him what he wants." 10 minutes later, the front doors of the governor's mansion opened to reveal a scene that would be remembered in territorial history for decades to come. Dorothy stood on the wide front steps flanked by federal marshals and territorial officials facing a crowd of hundreds of citizens who had gathered to witness what many sensed would be a defining moment. Across the street, Harrison Reed sat on Gamna's horse like a king surveying his domain, his 20 hired gunmen arrayed behind him in a show of force that would have intimidated any normal opposition. But the crowd that faced him was far from normal. These were people who had traveled from across the territory, drawn by a story that had captured their imagination and ignited their sense of justice. Joseph Reed was beside his father, his face flushed with whiskey and rage as he stared at the woman who had defied him. Dorothy met his gaze steadily, no longer the broken victim he had married, but someone transformed by suffering into something stronger than steel. "Eleanor Reed," Harrison's voice carried across the square with the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "You will return to your lawful husband immediately, or face the consequences of your rebellion." Dorothy stepped forward, her voice clear and strong in the evening air. "My name is Dorothy Thornwood," she called back. "Eleanor Reed died at the whipping post in Cedar Falls, killed by the cruelty of men who mistake power for righteousness." A murmur ran through the crowd at her words, and Reed's face darkened with fury. "You are legally married to my son, bound by law and sacred vow to obey his will. These people who shelter you are criminals harboring a fugitive from justice." "What justice?" Dorothy's voice rose, carrying to every corner of the square. "The justice that sentences a woman to death for being unable to bear children. The justice that allows men to beat their wives in public squares while calling it law." Crawford stepped forward, his official status evident in the way he carried himself. Mr. Reed, I am James Crawford, Territorial Attorney General. I hereby inform you that you are under arrest for corruption, intimidation, and conspiracy to commit murder. Reed's laugh was cold and contemptuous. You have no authority here, Crawford. This is a local matter handled by local law under local jurisdiction. Local law that you've corrupted beyond recognition, Crawford replied. Judge Hamilton's warrant is worthless, bought and paid for with bribes and threats. Your son's marriage to this woman was a sham designed to give you legal cover for abuse and murder. The crowd pressed closer, sensing that the moment of truth was at hand. Dorothy could see faces in the gathering darkness. Women who had suffered in silence, men who had watched injustice and said nothing, children who were learning what courage looked like. Joseph finally lost control, spurring his horse forward with his gun drawn. Enough talk. Eleanor, you're coming with me right now, or I'll... You'll what? Dorothy interrupted, stepping down from the mansion steps to meet him in the street. Beat me, torture me, kill me. Her voice carried clearly in the sudden silence. You've already tried all of that, Joseph. What else do you have? For a moment, husband and wife faced each other in the flickering gaslight, their history written in the scars on her back and the hatred in his eyes. But Dorothy was no longer the same woman who had cringed before his anger. She stood straight and tall, unafraid. I have the law, Joseph snarled. I have rights. You're my property, my wife, and I'll drag you back to Cedar Falls if I have to. Then you'll have to, Dorothy said simply, because I'm not going willingly. The standoff stretched taut as a wire fence, 20 guns against hundreds of witnesses, old law against new justice. And then from somewhere in the crowd, a woman's voice called out, "She's not alone." Another voice joined the first, then another, until the entire crowd was chanting the same words. She's not alone. She's not alone. Reed's men shifted nervously in their saddles, realizing that they were facing not just federal marshals, but an entire community that had chosen to stand together. Even professional gunmen thought twice about opening fire on hundreds of civilians, especially with newspaper reporters taking notes and federal witnesses recording every word. It was Harrison Reed who finally recognized the hopelessness of his position. His empire had been built on fear and isolation, on keeping his victims separated and defenseless. But Dorothy had become something he couldn't control, a symbol that had united his enemies and given them courage to act. This isn't over, he called out, already turning his horse away from the confrontation. We'll settle this in court with proper law and proper judges. Yes, we will, Crawford agreed. But not your courts and not your judges, federal courts with federal law and federal justice. As Reed's men began to retreat, Joseph made one last desperate attempt to salvage his pride. He raised his gun toward Dorothy, his face twisted with murderous rage. But before he could fire, 3 shots rang out almost simultaneously. Samuel's rifle cracked from the mansion steps, Liam's Colt barked from beside Dorothy, and Marshal Henderson's weapon spoke from the shadows. Joseph tumbled from his horse, his gun falling harmlessly to the cobblestones. Joseph! Harrison Reed's cry was that of a father watching his son fall, but it was too late for regrets. Federal marshals moved quickly to secure the wounded man, while other lawmen moved to arrest Reed himself. The crowd erupted in cheers as Dorothy rushed to Liam's side, followed by his children, who had watched their chosen family face down the demons that had haunted them for months. Grace threw her arms around Dorothy, while Samuel and Lily pressed close, their young faces bright with the knowledge that they had won something more valuable than safety. They had won the right to choose their own destiny. As federal marshals led Harrison Reed away in chains, Dorothy found herself surrounded by well-wishers and supporters who had come from across the territory to witness this moment. Women pressed her hands and whispered their thanks, while men spoke of the courage it had taken to stand up to Reed's empire of fear. But it was the children who mattered most, Samuel, whose steady aim had helped save her life. Grace, whose fierce loyalty had never wavered, and Lily, whose simple words had captured the truth that none of the adults could express. Dr. Morgan appeared in the crowd, having traveled from Cedar Falls to witness the resolution of the story he had helped begin. His face was bright with satisfaction as he approached Dorothy and her new family. "I heard they burned down your ranch," he said to Liam. "I'm sorry about that. Houses can be rebuilt." Liam replied, his arm around Dorothy's shoulders. "Families are harder to replace." "About that," Dr. Morgan said with a smile, "the territorial government has authorized compensation for families who suffered losses due to Reed's corruption. You'll have enough to rebuild and probably improve on what you had before." But Dorothy was thinking about something more important than houses or money. She was thinking about the future that stretched ahead of them, a future where children could grow up without fear, where women could be valued for more than their ability to bear sons, where justice meant more than the whims of powerful men. A week later, they stood together in the office of the territorial judge, a real judge appointed by the federal government and beholden to no local interests. Dorothy's hand trembled only slightly as she signed the papers that would legally make her Dorothy Thornwood wife to Liam and mother to Samuel, Grace, and Lily. The ceremony was simple, witnessed by Dr. Morgan and Attorney General Crawford, but it carried more meaning than any elaborate wedding could have provided. This wasn't just a marriage, it was the formal recognition of a family forged in adversity and strengthened by choice. As they walked out of the courthouse into the bright sunshine of a new day, Lily tugged on Dorothy's dress to get her attention. "Mama," she said clearly, the word carrying all the love and acceptance that had been building in her young heart. "Can we go home now?" Dorothy knelt down to embrace the little girl who had given her the greatest gift of all, the name that mattered most. Not Eleanor, the failed wife, not Dorothy, the broken victim, but Mama, the woman who had chosen love over fear, family over safety, courage over surrender. "Yes, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "We can go home." The Thornwood family climbed into their wagon and began the journey back to their land, where they would rebuild not just a house, but a life. Behind them, the territorial capital buzzed with the news of Reed's arrest and the revelations of corruption that would reshape the entire territory. Ahead of them lay the work of building something new and better on the ashes of what had been destroyed. As the wagon wheels turned on the familiar road toward home, Dorothy realized that her transformation was complete. She had begun this journey as a woman who believed herself worthless, deserving of punishment for her failures. She ended it as someone who understood that worth wasn't determined by others, it was claimed by the choices you made and the love you gave and received. The scars on her back would never fully heal, but they no longer defined her. They were simply part of her story, proof that she had endured the worst that hatred could offer and emerged stronger. She was Dorothy Thornwood, now mother and wife, survivor and symbol, a woman who had looked into the darkness and chosen light. Behind them, the territorial capital faded into the distance, but the changes they had set in motion would ripple outward for years to come. Reed's empire was finished. His corrupt judges removed his reign. Of fear ended. Other women would benefit from Dorothy's courage. Other families would find safety in the precedent she had set. But for now, as the wagon carried them toward the place where they would build their new life together, Dorothy was content to be simply what she had always wanted to be, a woman who belonged somewhere, who was loved for who she was rather than condemned for who she wasn't. The sun was setting as they reached the blackened ruins of the original Thornwood ranch. But instead of sorrow, Dorothy felt only anticipation. Tomorrow they would begin building again, creating something better from the ashes of destruction. Tonight they would camp under the stars as a family, telling stories and making plans and celebrating the victory that had cost them everything, but given them more than they had ever dared to dream. As Lily fell asleep in Dorothy's arms and the older children settled into their bedrolls, beside the campfire, Dorothy looked up at the vast canopy of stars that stretched endlessly overhead. Somewhere among those distant lights, she thought Margaret Thornwood was watching over the family she had loved, and the woman who now carried on her legacy of strength and love. The whipping post in Cedar Falls had been torn down, Dr. Morgan had written to tell them. In its place, the new town council had erected a small monument, bearing a simple inscription in memory of all who suffered and in honor of those who refused to let suffering have the final word. Dorothy thought that Margaret would have approved. After all, refusing to let suffering have the final word was exactly what family was for. The morning sun painted the newly constructed walls of the Thornwood ranch house in shades of gold and amber, a warm contrast to the weathered timbers that had replaced what Reed's men had burned 6 months ago. Dorothy stood at the kitchen window, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that steamed in the cool October air, watching as Samuel and Liam worked together to repair the fence line that bordered their expanded property. The territorial government's compensation had been more generous than any of them had expected, allowing them not only to rebuild, but to purchase additional land from Reed's seized assets. What had once been a modest ranch was now a substantial spread, complete with a larger house, improved barns, and pastures that stretched toward the distant mountains where Chief Running Bear's people still hunted. "The coffee smells wonderful," Grace said, emerging from the pantry with her arms full of preserving jars. At 13 now, she had grown taller over the summer, her copper hair catching the morning light as she moved with the efficient grace of someone who had learned early to carry her share of responsibility. "Mrs. Peterson's blend," Dorothy replied, settling the cups on the kitchen table that Liam had crafted from oak salvaged from their old barn. She brought it yesterday along with news from the territorial capital. The news had been significant. Harrison Reed's trial had concluded with his conviction on charges of corruption, conspiracy, and abuse of power. He would spend the rest of his life in the territorial prison, his empire of fear finally dismantled. Judge Hamilton had been removed from office and faced his own criminal charges, while Joseph Reed remained in the territorial hospital, his wounds from that confrontation 6 months ago having healed his body but left his mind broken by the collapse of everything he had believed about power and control. "Is Papa coming in for breakfast?" Grace asked, beginning to slice bread with the kind of practiced efficiency that would have made any frontier wife proud. "Soon. He wants to finish that section before the weather turns." Dorothy moved to the stove where bacon was already sizzling in the cast-iron pan. Lily's still sleeping, like a log. She stayed up late working on her letters to Running Bear's granddaughter. "I think she's teaching her English words in exchange for Lakota ones." The friendship between Lily and Little Moon Chief, Running Bear's 8-year-old granddaughter, had been one of the unexpected joys of their new life. The Sioux chief had made good on his promise to remain connected to the family that had shown such courage, and his periodic visits had brought not only security but genuine friendship. Little Moon's visits had done more to encourage Lily's speech than any amount of adult coaxing, the two girls chattering in a mixture of English and Lakota that delighted both families. "Morning, Mama Dorothy," called a sleepy voice from the hallway, and Lily appeared in her nightgown, her dark hair tousled from sleep, but her gray eyes already alert with the curiosity that had returned as she healed from her early trauma. The name had evolved naturally over the months. Dorothy was simply Mama to Lily, but Mama Dorothy to Grace and Samuel, who were old enough to remember their birth mother, but young enough to embrace the woman who had chosen to love them. It was a distinction that honored the past while embracing the present, and it suited Dorothy perfectly. "Good morning, sweetheart," Dorothy said, lifting Lily onto a chair at the table. "Did you sleep well?" "I dreamed about the new school," Lily said, accepting a cup of milk and a slice of bread with honey. Miss Catherine was there, and she had books about everything. The school was another change that had come with their improved circumstances. Catherine Morrison, a young teacher from the East, who had answered the territorial government's call for educators, had arrived in the rebuilt Cedar Falls just as the autumn term was beginning. She was a woman of perhaps 25, with serious brown eyes and the kind of quiet determination that reminded Dorothy of herself in some ways. "Are you excited about starting?" Dorothy asked, though she already knew the answer. Lily had been counting the days until the school opened, her hunger for learning evident in the way she devoured every book that came into the house. "Very excited," Samuel says. "Miss Catherine knows about plants and animals and mathematics and geography and literature and—" Lily's voice trailed off as she realized she was chattering a habit that still surprised the adults who remembered her years of silence. "Samuel's been helping her set up the schoolhouse," Grace added with a knowing smile. "Every day for the past 2 weeks." Dorothy hid her own smile behind her coffee cup. Samuel's sudden interest in education had coincided remarkably with Miss Catherine's arrival, and while he claimed to be merely helping a neighbor, his careful attention to his appearance on those helping days told a different story. The sound of boots on the front porch announced the arrival of the men, and Liam and Samuel entered the kitchen with the easy camaraderie that had developed between them over the months of rebuilding. Samuel had grown several inches over the summer, his shoulders broadening with the kind of work that turned boys into men, but his relationship with his father had deepened rather than strained as he approached adulthood. "Fence is secure for winter," Liam announced, hanging his hat on the peg by the door and moving to wash his hands at the basin. "Samuel's got a good eye for weak spots. Miss Catherine says attention to detail is important in all endeavors," Samuel replied, his casual mention of the teacher earning pointed looks from his sisters. "Does she now?" Dorothy said mildly, setting plates of bacon and eggs on the table. "And what other wisdom has Miss Catherine shared?" Samuel's cheeks reddened slightly, but he met her gaze with the steady confidence that had carried him through their darkest days. "She says education is the foundation of progress and that frontier communities need young people who are willing to learn and lead." "Sounds like a wise woman," Liam observed, settling into his chair at the head of the table. "Speaking of which, Dr. Morgan stopped by yesterday while you were in town. He had some interesting news." Dorothy felt a familiar flutter of concern. Despite all the changes and improvements in their lives, she still felt a shadow of anxiety whenever unexpected news arrived. The months of constant danger had left their mark, creating a vigilance that might never fully fade. "What kind of news?" she asked, setting down her own plate and joining the family at the table. "The kind you'll want to hear sitting down," Liam said, with a smile that suggested the news was good rather than threatening. "It seems the territorial legislature has been discussing ways to honor the people who helped bring down Reed's corruption." "We don't need honors," Dorothy said quickly. "We did what anyone should have done." "That's exactly what makes you worthy of them," Grace pointed out with the logic that made her such a formidable opponent in family discussions. "Besides, it's not just about us. It's about sending a message to other places where people like Reed might be in power." Samuel nodded agreement. "Miss Catherine says symbolic gestures can have real political impact, especially in territories that are trying to establish their reputations for law and order." "Miss Catherine certainly has opinions about everything," Lily observed innocently, earning snickers from Grace and a deeper blush from Samuel. "The point," Liam continued, clearly enjoying the family dynamics, "is that the legislature wants to create a new award for civilian courage, and they want our family to be the first recipients." Dorothy considered this information while cutting her bacon into neat pieces, a habit she had developed during her recovery when her wounds made certain movements difficult. The idea of public recognition still made her uncomfortable, though she understood Grace's point about the broader significance. "What would receiving this award involve?" she asked, finally. "A ceremony in the territorial capital, probably some speeches, definitely newspaper coverage. The kind of attention that would make clear to everyone that the territory supports people who stand up for justice. And that the territory protects them, Samuel added, which could encourage other people to speak up when they see corruption or abuse. It was a compelling argument, and Dorothy found herself nodding despite her instinctive reluctance. If their story could help other families avoid what they had endured, perhaps the exposure would be worthwhile. "There's something else," Liam said, his tone suggesting he had saved the most significant news for last. Dr. Morgan also mentioned that the territorial governor is considering establishing a new county with its center here in the rebuilt Cedar Falls. They want someone to serve as the first county commissioner, someone with a reputation for integrity and courage. The implications hit Dorothy immediately. "They want you to run for office." "They want us to consider it," Liam corrected. "Both of us. The position would involve making decisions about law enforcement, education, land use, all the things that determine what kind of community we become." Grace looked up from her breakfast, her green eyes bright with interest. "Would we have to move to town?" "Not necessarily. The commissioner position is designed to serve the entire county, not just the town center. We could stay here and travel to Cedar Falls for official business." Dorothy found herself considering possibilities she had never imagined. 6 months ago, she had been a woman with no voice and no power, whose very existence was considered a burden by the people who should have protected her. Now she was being asked to help govern a county, to have a say in shaping the future of an entire community. "What do you think?" she asked Lily, whose opinion had become increasingly important to family decisions as her voice had returned and her confidence had grown. Lily finished chewing a bite of bread before answering with the seriousness that made her seem older than her 9 years. "I think Mama Margaret would say we should help other families if we can." The mention of Liam's first wife brought a moment of reflective silence to the table. Margaret's presence was still felt in the house, not as a ghost that haunted them, but as a foundation that supported them. Her photographs still hung on the walls, her recipes were still used in the kitchen, and her memory was still honored in the way the family made decisions based on love and principle rather than fear and expedience. "I think she would say that too," Liam agreed quietly. "But she'd also say that we shouldn't take on more than we can handle. Being a public official means being a target, and we've had enough of that for one lifetime." "Have we, though?" Samuel asked, surprising them all with the question. "I mean, hiding from responsibility because it might be dangerous isn't really hiding, is it? It's just letting other people make the decisions that affect our lives." Dorothy looked at her eldest stepson with new appreciation. The boy who had once cleaned his rifle with grim necessity had grown into a young man who understood that courage wasn't just about fighting, it was about choosing to engage with the world, even when engagement carried risks. "Besides," Grace added, "it's not like we'd be doing it alone. We have friends now, people who would support us and help us succeed." She was right, Dorothy realized. Their isolation, which had once made them vulnerable to Reed's attacks, had been replaced by a network of relationships that provided both support and accountability. Dr. Morgan remained a close friend and advisor. Chief Running Bear's people had become genuine allies, and even newcomers like Miss Catherine were proving to be valuable additions to their community. "There's one more thing to consider," Dorothy said slowly, the idea forming even as she spoke. "If we're going to shape the future of this county, we should make sure it's a place where all families can thrive, not just the ones that look like us or think like us." Liam's eyes met hers across the table, and she saw understanding pass between them. They were thinking of the same things the Sioux families who had helped them when no one else would, the Mexican families who worked some of the smaller ranches, the Chinese immigrants who had built the railroad and stayed to build lives, all the people who had been marginalized by Reed's vision of what the territory should become. "A county where being different doesn't make you a target," Samuel said, showing that he too understood the broader implications. "Where children can go to school regardless of what their parents look like or where they came from," Grace added, where women don't get beaten for things they can't control. Lily concluded with the devastating simplicity that had become her trademark. Dorothy felt a surge of pride in these children who had become her own, who had learned lessons about justice and compassion, not from books, but from living through injustice and discovering what it meant to fight back with love rather than hatred. "Then I think we should do it," she said, her voice carrying the same quiet determination that had sustained her through 91 lashes and the long journey that followed. "I think we should help build the kind of community we want to live in." The decision made breakfast conversation turned to practical matters. They would need to learn about county government, about budgets and regulations, and the 1,000 details that turned good intentions into effective policy. Samuel would finish his education while helping with the ranch. Grace would continue her own studies while taking on more responsibility for the household, and Lily would start school with the excitement of a child who had never doubted that knowledge was a gift worth pursuing. After breakfast, as the family scattered to their various tasks, Dorothy found herself standing again at the kitchen window, looking out at the land that had become home in ways she had never imagined possible. The scars on her back still ached on cold mornings, and she suspected they always would, but they no longer defined her. She was Dorothy Thornwood now, wife and mother, survivor and leader, a woman who had learned that strength wasn't the absence of breaking, it was the decision to rebuild yourself into something better than you had been before. The whipping post in Cedar Falls was gone, torn down, and replaced by a monument to resilience. But the real monument was here, in this kitchen, where a blended family planned their future in the love that had grown from the ashes of hatred, in the quiet determination to make sure that what they had suffered would serve a purpose larger than themselves. Outside, Samuel was already hitching the wagon for the trip to town, where he would help Miss Catherine prepare for the school's opening, and Dorothy would meet with Dr. Morgan to discuss the logistics of a political campaign. It was a future she could never have imagined when she was Eleanor Reed, but it was the future Dorothy Thornwood had chosen to build, and for the first time in her life, that future looked exactly like home.